The world's biggest car manufacturer and maybe the biggest ever corporate scandal. If you're a VW shareholder or employee today, the letters stand for very worried. Unlike the banking scandals of recent years, this one isn't measured in money.
Nitrogen dioxide causes asthma, it causes strokes, it causes birth abnormalities. It causes people to die earlier than they should do. And Volkswagen took a decision to fit technology and software to their vehicle, knowing that their cars will produce much more, in the case of the US, 40 times more pollution on the road than they were allowed to.
What VW has admitted is a massive technical fraud. The company fitted US diesel vehicles with technology that would detect that the vehicle was being tested and adjust its performance to pass the test.
Michael Horn.
A sparkly PR event in New York last night to launch a new model turned into an admission of guilt.
So let's be clear about this. Our company was dishonest with the EPA and the California Air Resources Board and with all of you. And in my German words, we have totally screwed up.
The fraud was detected by the International Council on Clean Transportation. Because US diesel cars have to pass far tougher emission standards, they wanted to know how VW had managed to do it, to put pressure on them to do the same in Europe. What they found astonished them.
We had 5 routes that we drove these vehicles on in the real world, and on all 5 routes emissions were very high, 5 to 30 times the standard. And yet, when the same vehicles were tested at the California Air Resources Board laboratory over the official test cycle, they passed the emissions. So we have passing the official test and yet 5 to 30 times the emissions in the real world. And that rang some alarm bells.
The question is, how much further does this fraud go?
I think in the very near future, as more tests are carried out and investigations are conducted in a number of countries, we will find other manufacturers have been fitting similar defeat devices. Just as the LIBOR scandal was not one bank, I think we will find that the defeat devices scandal is more than one car maker.
The Transport and Environment think tank has found that many European cars have far higher real-world emissions than the EU's legal limit. For VW cars, it was found to be 2.6 times higher than the legal limit. For BMW, it was 4 times the limit, as it was with Mercedes. For Citroën, it was 3.9 times. Meanwhile, Audi, part of the VW group, it was 8.2 times the legal limit. The question is, what's behind these results? Is anyone else using defeat devices? According to a company that does independent real-world testing, it's not necessary to go to such lengths in Europe because the test is so easy to pass.
The test was developed in the 1970s and the rules are easier to bend. And so, in effect, manufacturers don't have to go to the extremes that VW have gone to in the States in order to get a pass for their emissions. There are other things that they can do. This software has been put into 11 million vehicles, I believe, but whether or not they have also been implementing the software for the European market, I don't know, but I wouldn't have thought that was necessary.
But what about other manufacturers in the US? Well, the researchers who discovered the VW fraud also tested a BMW X5 diesel at the same time, but they found its real-world NOx emissions at or below the test limits. So where does this leave VW? At the moment, alone. The potential bill could reach $18 billion. It's facing investigations by the US Justice Department, the Environmental Protection Agency, as well as the New York Attorney General. Other jurisdictions will certainly follow. The reputational damage for previously one of the world's most trusted brands could be incalculable.
David Grossman there. Well, there are a lot of implications of this crisis. It's bad for car part makers, including the British company GKN, whose shares fell 6% today. It's a big supplier to VW. It's bad for Germany's sense of pride. VW has given Germany a psychological shock as the company, better than any other, represents the post-war national brand. And above all, and perhaps most importantly, the crisis is bad for diesel. The fuel that was encouraged for years, as it is substantially better than petrol when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, is now exposed as potentially worse than thought when it comes to other emissions. Well, let's digest some of those implications now. I'm with Professor David Bailey from Aston University, and thanks for joining us, David. Look, first of all, I mean, how many people do you think realised that defeat software existed and was quite likely used by one or more vehicle manufacturers? We did report it in December, so how come the rest of the world missed it?
There have been some reports from pressure groups suggesting that this was the case, but there was no direct evidence. And what's really new about this is it's actually been tested, it's found to actually be in operation, and the company has admitted it. So that's what's different this time round. For quite a long time, people have been saying, look, the test performance doesn't match real-world performance. The feeling has been maybe the tests haven't been adequate enough. In this case, we find out that VW is actually cheating.
Right. OK, perhaps the most important question, for all sorts of reasons, is whether this kills diesel. Diesel was suffering quite a big negative backlash, wasn't it, at the moment in Europe? And I just wonder whether this is another knock to the reputation of that fuel.
Yes, I think it is. It'll probably kill the market in the United States. VW was trying to get it going there as a clean technology. I think that's now dead. Certainly in the European case, we'd gone down the diesel route in a very big way. Go back to the 1990s, it was a niche player. We've embraced diesel because of the lower CO2 tailpipe emissions. We're now finding all of these other issues around diesel in terms of air quality, particularly in urban environments. Now, the industry have been putting a huge effort into trying to convince regulators and policymakers that particularly the new European 6 regulations were very good and they were tackling the problem. This is going to blow it wide open again, both in terms of whether the regulations are adequate, but in particular whether the testing regime is up to scratch. And I think we'll also see much more intervention at the city level, where city mayors around Europe are starting to regulate this much more heavily.
Look, the truth is, you can save money by buying a diesel because they are a lot more, particularly if you're doing quite a few miles. They're just much more, you get many more miles per gallon than you do with a petrol car. Is it now, do you think, antisocial to buy a diesel-engined car?
Well, we'd also been encouraged to buy diesel cars through the tax regime. So given that taxes on cars reflected CO2 tailpipe emissions, we'd gone down that diesel route. There is certainly a question mark now as to whether this is, from a public point of view, the right thing to be doing. We'd gone to concentrate very much on tailpipe CO2, not these wider issues. I actually gave up my diesel car a couple of years ago because I was worried about these things and switched over to a petrol hybrid. So yes, this is going to be a bigger issue going forward, and we may see a decline in diesel sales in Europe as a result of it. The winners will be the petrol hybrid and maybe the electric cars of the future.
Right, but you're making a very important point there, because as I understand it, 3/4 of the world's diesel cars are bought in Europe.
Yep.
Most new car sales in Europe last year were diesel cars. It's amazing, really, to think where they used to be. And European companies in particular have invested in the technology, spending billions on diesel technology. So this could be very bad for the European car makers as opposed to the Asians and the Americans, right?
That's absolutely right. And if we think about the whole kind of trying to tackle global warming, the Japanese and the Americans have invested very heavily in hybrid cars and electric cars. Here in Europe, the focus has been very much on improving the internal combustion engine and in particular diesel. So it's the European manufacturers which are particularly exposed on this because that's where they've made their bet. The question is, have they made the wrong bet, and is it going to cost them?
Is there anything you can do? Is there a fix? Is there a thing you can shove on the exhaust pipe that cleans up the diesel so you can get the advantages of low CO2 without the disadvantages of NOx pollutants?
Well, certainly there are ways of adding a sort of a system to try and take out those NOx emissions. The question for VW in the short term is whether it's simply a software fix or whether they have to physically install a system into these cars in the US. Now, that could cost them thousands per vehicle. And the cost of that could be very substantial. Now, they've put aside 6.5 billion euros to deal with this. That's just the beginning. Double that at least in terms of the overall cost for the company.
Amazing, isn't it? We've always known that diesel was dirty for local pollutants and clean for greenhouse gases. It's kind of like suddenly it seems to hit us as a shock, and yet it's the basic chemistry of the stuff. We have known it, haven't we?
Well, this has been brewing for some time, and I think partly that's why there's been this political backlash in Europe. And not very long ago, a French minister was saying we made a mistake going into diesels, and we're seeing cities around Europe trying to start to regulate them much more closely. So, yes, we've known this. We've become much more focused on greenhouse emissions and climate change rather than a concern about public health and air quality in cities. Now that balance is now changing.